Welcome back to another solo episode of B2B Growth. If you haven't been listening for the last couple weeks, this is a new thing that I'm trying this month to do little solo episodes, give you a little bit of a taste of how I'm thinking, how I'm growing as an entrepreneur, as a marketer. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about 4 reasons why I consider this podcast, B2B Growth, to be a success. And so the first reason that I'm going to dive into is the fact that this podcast drives revenue. If you've been listening for any time at all, you know that at the root of our podcast strategy is the guests that we bring on to the show. Each guest we bring on, for the most part, probably 98% of the guests that we bring on are ideal clients for our business. We run a podcast agency. We produce podcasts for B2B brands. And so us bringing on CEOs and VPs of marketing and CMOs at B2B companies with 50 plus employees, typically, those are our ideal buyers. And so that's why you hear a lot of those people as guests on our show, because in addition to creating great content with this person, with every guest that we interview, I'm building a legitimate relationship with them because I know that, hey, at some point they can actually buy what we're selling. And so just to give you kind of a real world case study of how this podcast drives revenue for us, in the first 2 months of 2018, you're probably hearing this towards the end of March, maybe April of 2018, but as I'm recording this, we just wrapped up February, and in the first 2 months of 2018, we have closed 9 new deals. So 9 new customers that we're producing podcasts for. Of the 9, 5 of those we first met by them being a guest on our podcast. Of those 5, 3 of those guests were on our show well over a year ago, and 2 of them were on our show in the last couple months. One actually was on our show, and then 6 days later became a customer. And so that is how we are driving revenue through this podcast. So regardless of the fact that we're getting over 50,000 downloads a month, this podcast is a success in my eyes because we can directly attribute this show to revenue in the sense of us closing deals with guests, not listeners. It's much harder to attribute listenership to actual closed deals. I know for sure that we have closed deals with listeners after having conversations with them after they've closed, but that's muddy, and unless you ask those questions, it's really tough to know that. But I know I can say definitively that of 5 of the 9 deals that we've closed so far this year have come from podcast guests who otherwise we would have not closed a deal with apart from asking them to be on our show. So that is the first reason that I think this podcast is a success, is because we're closing deals with the guests that we feature on the show. And we're just very focused on featuring ideal clients as guests. I think when people get into podcasting, they think, I'm going to interview thought leaders, and I'm going to interview authors of books and people with these great ideas, and we're going to put out great content. And that's great if your goal is not to generate revenue from your show in the relative short term. Us being a young business, we needed our show to generate revenue early on. And when we figured out the cadence of getting the right types of guests onto our show, we started closing deals with those guests. So we say no to a lot of people that reach out and ask us to be on the show, not because I don't think that they would have great content to share. I'm sure they would have great content to share, but I know that the people we're reaching out to that are prospective clients for us also have great content to share, because you don't become the VP of marketing or the CMO at a B2B company with 50 plus employees without having some knowledge and some wisdom to share. You don't become the CEO of a company on the Inc. 500 list without having some really great ideas and strategies that you can share with our listeners. So we have just chosen, instead of featuring a lot of book authors and thought leaders, to feature our ideal clients. And so that's the first number one, hands down, the absolute number one reason that I think this show is a success. So I think a second reason, and really these last three reasons that I'm going to talk about, I believe wholeheartedly that the biggest benefit of B2B podcasting is the relationships that you build with guests. But the metrics that most marketers are impressed with when I talk to them about B2B growth is the fact that we're getting, over 50,000 downloads a month. And so even though I don't think that that is super relevant, I think that keeps a lot of people from podcasting is because they think they have to have a big audience for it to actually drive revenue for the business, which is not the case. If our show was not getting 50,000 downloads a month, we would have still closed those 5 deals earlier this year with guests because very, very few people ask about audience size. And none of those deals that we closed, that to my knowledge, asked how big our audience was before they hopped on our show. And so I hesitate to talk about, these next 3 reasons, of why our show is successful, because it makes it sound like us having a big audience is the bulk of the reason that we're successful, and it's not. The biggest reason this show I consider to be a success is because guests drive revenue, not listeners. But because I know that so many marketers care about audience, they care about how many downloads they get, I'm going to spend some time talking about why I think we have been able to build the size of audience that we have. And these are things that I don't think I don't hear a lot of people talking about. So hopefully these will be helpful. So this second reason I think our show is successful, the first one that has to do with the growth of our audience, is because we ranked for the keyword B2B in the iTunes ecosystem. And I don't hear a lot of people, even in the podcasting world, talking about the importance of this. But over and over again, I hear from our listeners that that's how they found us. They found us because they searched B2B in iTunes or the Apple Podcasts player, and up popped our show. For a while, we were ranked number 1. I think now we're ranked number 2. Anytime you put in B2B in the podcast player, you're going to find our show, and that has just been a massive arbitrage of attention for us. Which I cannot understate. I would love to say that, it's because of the quality of our show that we're getting such a good audience, which is, I feel like, what everybody says, like, put out quality stuff and your audience will come. No, for us, we're obviously I think we're putting out really great content, but if we weren't ranking for the keyword B2B in iTunes, there's no way that we would be getting 50,000 plus downloads a month right now. And so what's that mean for you? I think, we started a couple years ago. And so we got a jump on the market, and there's now a lot of podcasts that wish that they could rank for the term B2B that are not ranking for that term because just the sheer volume of shows with that title in the name. Because we started the show a couple of years ago, it is something that and we've put out a lot of episodes now, so I think we are pretty firmly established in those rankings. Obviously, iTunes could change their algorithm tomorrow, and we could lose that. So we are vulnerable in that sense. But I'm going to ride this out as long as we possibly can, because we're getting new listeners every month as a result. But think about your industry. If there aren't a lot of podcasts in your space, think about if you're going to start a show, putting the keyword that your buyers are going to be searching for in the headline of your show. And if there are ways to put that keyword in a lot of your episodes as well, I can't say definitively because I'm not an insider at iTunes, but I do think that having the title predominantly displayed in the title of our show, as well as each of the headlines. We obviously put B2B in a lot of the individual headlines of our episodes, so I think that helps us stay ranked. But think about your industry. If it's not a crowded space, if there's not a lot of podcasts in your space, there's probably an opportunity for you to capitalize on the same arbitrage of attention that we did. And as more and more people in your industry start consuming podcasts, which trends show that people are listening to more and more podcasts, so your buyers are likely adapting to their lifestyle to listen to more podcasts as well. So get in early, rank for your keyword, and you can capitalize on the same benefit that we have. As an example, my friend Lucas McCurdy just started a show called Bridge the Gap. And in his graphic of his show, it says Bridge the Gap, and it says the Senior Living Podcast. But the headline of his show only was Bridge the Gap. And so I shot him a text because his show just went live, and I said, hey man, adjust the headline of the main title of your podcast to be Bridge the Gap, the Senior Living Podcast, because people in the senior living space are not going to be searching Bridge the Gap. They're going to be searching senior living. And if their show is not ranked for senior living, especially now, because I don't think there's probably less than a handful of podcasts that are trying to rank for that term right now. So they've got a really good shot at ranking for it since they are early to the podcast game. And so that's something I'm sure he's going to implement soon. But that's an example of, getting the keyword that you're trying to rank for in the main title of your podcast name. Even if it's a subtitle, make sure that it's in there as in your podcast host as the main title of your episode. This third reason that I think our show is so successful is the fact that we do a daily show. I know a lot of you listening to this don't want to hear that as being a key to this success, but I really do think that we have the numbers we have from an audience perspective because the volume of content that we produce. Every single episode we put out is getting shared by our guests because we have a process in place to email every guest and let them know when their episode goes live. I think people sometimes put way too much stock in that, and they think that the guest that they feature is going to bring just this massive amount of listeners to their show. I don't think that that's true. Because most of the people that we feature don't have super strong engagement on their with their personal brand, because it's not something they've invested a whole lot of time into. But even when we've had mega influencers on the show like Simon Sinek, Gary Vaynerchuk, those episodes are actually not downloaded any more than any of our other episodes. And so by thinking, I'm going to go after a bunch of thought leaders because I want them to share our content, the reality is those people are putting out a lot of content themselves, and so they're not concerned with sharing your episode. And then the other people that you feature, if you are featuring ideal buyers, there's a good chance they don't have a massive social presence, but the way that we mitigate for that is just the volume of it. And so we know every week we've got 5 different people that are our ideal buyers that are sharing their episode within their network. It's not massive reach, but over time it builds. And so we've got all these, at the time I'm recording this, over 650 episodes now that are out in the world that were shared by our guests that are ultimately driving people back to us. And it's evergreen content. It's not something that goes away. And so there are people, finding that, somebody shared an episode that they did with us a year and a half ago that are going to map back, find that episode, subscribe to our show. Once they, because they see that it's a show that's going live every single day. So I think that's a huge reason, and it keeps people away from doing it when they hear that if I have to do a daily show to really get an audience, then I just don't have the time or the bandwidth to do it. But the reality is we've set up a system that allows us to do that. These are 12 to 15 minute conversations. They're fluff-free interviews. We don't allocate an hour of time for each interview. We allocate 20 minutes of time. And so when you think about that, that's an hour and a half every week to be able to pull off a 5-day-a-week podcast. And so it's just not as much time as people think. If you have, obviously if you're not working with an agency like ours to do the production of the show on the back end, it's much more time than that. So minor plug, use us or use someone like us to do the production of your show so that you can get to a volume that really allows you to expedite the process of growing your audience. Another thing that I hear a lot of people talk about when I talk about this idea of volume leading to our success is they say, well, James, I subscribe to the, quality being better than quantity. I just want to make sure that things are quality. And I just honestly think that's a little bit of BS. And honestly, I think it's an excuse for not producing more content. If I'm totally honest, I think people lean on that as an excuse of, we just want things to be really quality. And I don't know. I feel like every episode that we put out is really quality because we're featuring really, really smart people on our show about topics that they're passionate about, results that they've seen, strategies they've deployed, tactics they're using, and we just interview them for 12 to 15 minutes about the specificity of what those strategies and tactics are. And so it ends up being really quality content, and we've just done it in volume. And so I think we've cracked the code on quality and quantity. And because of that, we're seeing success. So if you're telling yourself, we can't do quantity because we want to focus on quality, I would just push against that a bit and say, look for a framework that you can deploy that allows you to do both, because we have, and maybe that looks, different. Maybe maybe your process will be a little bit different than ours, but I would challenge your thinking to say, can we do quality and quantity? And if we were to do that, how would we do it? And I think you'll land on something that will be effective. So this last one that I'm going to talk about, this fourth reason why I think our show is successful, is because our headlines are very specific. Because of the interview framework that we use for each guest, we ask guests to come up with the topics for their interview. We tell them, the show is about growth in a B2B context, and then we tell them the more granular that they can get with their topic, the better. That's actually a very crucial, seemingly under the radar sentence that I put in those emails that I have with each guest when I'm going back and forth. I wrote about this a little bit ago, but this idea that we ask our guests to come up with the topic, and we tell them to get granular with that topic. When you focus on a very specific thing, you can go deep on it, as opposed to 3 ways to grow your business. If I can do an episode that says how this company produced 47 case studies overnight, well, that's a much more compelling piece of content because it's way more specific than 3 ways to grow your business. And so I think because we structure our interviews like that, and because we lead our guests and really coach our guests to come up with topics that are very granular, we're able to have these headlines that end up being really compelling. And they tell our listeners exactly what they can expect. And so we ask the guests to come up with their topic, and then we tell them, hey, what would be 3 to 5 takeaways that you want our listeners to walk away with? This gives us a tangible number. When you can put a number in your headline, there's a reason why people click on numbered headlines all the time. There's a reason why BuzzFeed does it, because there's something in your brain that says, okay, I'm going to learn these 7 things, or these 4 things, or these 2 things. And so when someone knows what they're getting before they click that episode, they're more likely to click it because they know exactly what they can expect. And so I think with our headlines being very specific, it allows people to avoid an episode that they have no interest in learning about. Not everyone is interested in learning, about the 4 reasons why this podcast is successful. And so only people listening to this episode right now, if you're listening to this, you're listening because you're interested in this topic. And because you're interested, hopefully this brings a lot of value to you, and it gave you a good listening experience because you avoided listening to the other 3 episodes this week that you weren't interested in. And the fact of the matter is, if you can deliver a consistent, quality listening experience by giving people exactly what they want when they want it, they are going to stay subscribed to your show. And I think that is what we've done. The more listeners that I talk to, the more I realize that people do not listen to every single episode. With being a daily show, I would be hard pressed if anybody actually listens to every single episode. Most listeners listen to the episodes that make most sense for them and where they're at, the stage of business they're in, the problem they're trying to solve. And so if you're producing volume, like what I talked about in my last point, you're going to have a lot of content out there that people can choose from, and they can choose the content that is going to be most helpful for them. And if your content actually lives up to the headline and delivers the specific value that you claim to deliver, then people are going to come back for more, because they're going to trust you that you deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And so those are the 4 reasons why I think this show is successful. Again, the primary reason being that this thing drives revenue because of the guests that we feature on the show. We are closing deals with guests. Then it also is successful because of the audience that we've been able to amass. Getting over 50,000 downloads a month on a show is not an easy feat. And it's something that we've been able to do. So hopefully this is helpful. Would love to connect with anybody listening to this. Shoot me an email, james@sweetfishmedia.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn, James Carberry. You can shoot me a note on Twitter, @JamesCarberry there. Would love to connect. The more of you that I hear from, the better. I just love hearing from folks that are getting value from this thing. So appreciate it, and have a fantastic weekend.